So let's just dive right into it. What is this dyslexia and what is Lexi dyslexia?
Sure. So I guess first question, what is dyslexia? So
Yes.
dyslexia is the best way to kind of describe what dyslexia is the inability to actually comprehend written text effectively, right? When you see certain written texts, when they're in these shapes, which are like the letters that we commonly know, the dyslexic brain doesn't actually interpret those as easily as a non-dyslexic brain. Um, and this causes delays in reading, for example, or causes you to change different contexts of words. And so, for example, you'd read a paragraph that has, say, 10 words, but you've changed four of those words in your mind because you started seeing a THR and you went through instead of throw, for example. And by the time you get to the end of the paragraph, you're like, what did I just read? And so that's some of the things that kind of affect someone with dyslexia. Other than that, there's spelling and so forth. But there's also benefits to it. So the brain is structured actually differently. And if we go into scientific kind of explanation of how it works, the best way to describe, one of the things to describe is think of a rack of CDs, kind of like stacked up, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 4. And that's vertically in each person's brain. The distance between those CDs determines whether or not you may or may not be dyslexic, or is more commonly seen in those that are dyslexic. The closer the distance, the more likelihood of autism. The further the distance, the more likelihood of dyslexia. But what that means is that information relaying from here to here, that distance, that gap, is increased. And so that kind of difficulty to connect different information becomes more apparent in dyslexic individuals versus autistic individuals would be quick to it and very keen on answering it. The easiest of the hardest of questions for us becomes easiest of questions for them. Now, for the dyslexic brain, what I like to describe it is a dyslexic person takes what's called a scenic route. And when you take a scenic route, if I ask you a question and the answer is a dyslexic person would go B, D, C, A. But along the scenic route, you may have taken a longer route to get to the answer, but you saw more things, right? And you got to experience different things that may or may not be related and to the actual answer you want, making you better at problem solving, creative thinking, and such. So there's the kind of upside of having dyslexia. Most of the people that have struggled with dyslexia happens mostly in the education realm, right? Because if at a young age you're struggling to read and comprehend certain words just because you either need extra time on examinations or you need different colored paper or different font, these will inevitably affect the outcome of your grades. And because our system is structured in good grades equals good opportunity, then opportunities become a little bit harder for someone with dyslexia. So I was diagnosed with dyslexia at the age of 7. And because my brother's dyslexic and so is my grandmother, it's actually genetic. But it's actually 1 out of 5 people that might be dyslexic, right? And that's a lot of people. And so many people actually don't know whether or not they might be dyslexic. They just think, oh, I just struggled with a couple of things. There are more severe cases and less severe cases, but a lot of people just go through life struggling with dyslexia unknowing. So what I
But
wanted to do is,
that's 7 years old is really young, like really, really young. How did you know at that point that you might have dyslexia? Is it because it runs in the family or
a
something,
little bit of both.
something you were doing?
So a little bit of both. One is, yes, it runs with family, but I remember I asked my teacher, for example, how to spell the word I'm, as in I and am together. Right? A pretty simple question. And she responded by saying, are you stupid? Which wasn't great. And then, the more kind of problems I had with spelling and certain tasks, I had to kind of confront my parents. And in doing so, then they were like, you might be dyslexic, so let's test you. Now, thankfully, my parents tested me because my oldest brother was dyslexic and my grandmother was dyslexic. So we knew what this was. Now, we weren't experts on it, but it led me to get diagnosed and find out that I am dyslexic. So that's basically how I found out. I mean, it is early. Most individuals get diagnosed a little later, but ideally, in the best case scenario, is if you can diagnose someone at the age of 4, which is very early in the very beginnings, right? But starting early gives you a lot more time to actually figure out how to manage it better, right? Than going most of your life either with the mindset that I'm just not, I'm not smart enough, or I'm just not good enough, or going most of your life trying to figure out different ways that might work for you through trial and error, when you can get there a lot faster. Most of the time, it's here's your grade level and your reading level is here, right? And that's what's hindering you from reaching the potential that you actually need to get to. And so as much as it's getting diagnosed, it's also the support that has to come later. So what I wanted to do was to help, first of all, identify who may or may not be dyslexic. So that's step one of what I wanted to create. And to do so, you usually just go to a clinic and you go through a number of different tests. Some of them are memory-based, some of them are phonological-based, so it's more about speaking and spatial awareness, alongside a few other tests. And then you can get diagnosed. But you can digitize that pretty easily. Now, currently, most of what you find online is just surveys. But you can't really survey someone for dyslexia. You can't be like, on a scale of 1 to 5, how likely are you to read, out loud? How comfortable are you? I don't know. A lot of people aren't comfortable reading out loud. So you need to it has to be more scientific in a sense, right? And there's beginning to be a lot of a movement towards this, but not yet to the extent of where I want to take it. We're integrating AI and also speech to text and text to speech. And then the most important part is that support side that comes later. So that's what the platform would aim to do, right? So first and foremost, I go to a school, be like, okay, test all your kids, right? And I'll give you a likelihood of high, medium, or low chance of having dyslexia. And then when you notice who's high or medium, then you can go and have them take a full diagnostic at a clinic, and then we'll provide them with different support tools and different technologies that can help them, assist them, as well as different games that would help them improve on their either memory, spelling, information retrieval, and so forth. And that's kind of where the idea came from.
Life, it's obviously personal. Okay,
Yeah, of
when
course.
I jumped into this, I was not sure why someone would dedicate so much time into this unless it's really affecting them. So since it's in the family, it hit you as well. I mean, you probably have a lot of stories around this subject in particular. So it makes a lot of sense that you're tackling this problem and helping people who don't have the ability to do anything about it. But it's it's kind of crazy to me that we don't really talk a lot about it in the region. We don't really talk about dyslexia, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
it's bad sometimes in the region. Like you'd be surprised where sometimes you'd have some parents, for example, when you say, like, a teacher would tell them, your son might or daughter might have dyslexia, and they're like, لا أنا ابني ما عنده مرض. He doesn't have a disease, right? But it's not a disease, right? It's not contagious. It's he just struggles with comprehending written text. لا لا, but he just needs to work harder or push harder. But that doesn't help, right? And so there is raising awareness a lot. I mean, it's increased definitely from when I was diagnosed, but there's still so much yet to come. And in the UAE, for example, I mean, it's recognized. And for example, like the KHDA, which is part of the ministry that regulates education, they put in like certain like guidelines that if you meet said guidelines, it benefits you as a school. And one of those is inclusivity. And within inclusivity, dyslexia, ADHD, neurodiversities in particular, adds to that. And so schools are, whether it be more for selfish interest to be able to either raise their prices or become a better rating, it still has a genuine purpose, which is helping those who have neurodiversities.
and Leith, you're not just identifying people who have dyslexia, you're actually providing them with support through the platform. So can you just explain, if I am diagnosed with dyslexia, are you looking at this as something that can be cured, or are you looking at this as something that can be assisted to like guide you through life in a different way? Like, how exactly do you approach people through the platform?
Sure. So you can't really cure yourself for dyslexia, and there's no medication that you can take. Unlike, for example, ADD and ADHD, certain medications will help you become a little bit more focused or a little bit more calm to kind of help you with it. But with dyslexia, you're kind of just stuck with it. But first and foremost is to change the narrative that it's a disability, right? It was usually considered as a learning disability. To change it from that to an ability, right? So with dyslexia, you have certain things that you're actually better at, right? And there's certain studies around this idea that there's something called dyslexic advantage, right? And for example, you could have, and a common one is to be able to visually render objects in your mind in 3D. So if you're able to do this at a quite a good level, then perhaps starting at a younger age and directing you towards things that are more suited for your skill set would be more beneficial, right? So perhaps architecture or engineering, rather than you going through life. And for example, with me, I loved biology and I loved science, but I said, I'm not going to go into science and becoming a doctor because that's 7 years of education with a lot of memorization, a lot of difficult words that I'm not going to do well. So I just eliminated that factor, right? Because I was like, I have dyslexia, so I'm not going to do that. But that shouldn't be the case, right? So that's why that's part of the idea of where the support comes from. But support also comes from different tools that you could use. So I've been using, for example, Grammarly since 2014, when maybe it launched in 2013. I saw this thing that helps you with like spelling that's more than just, a red line that may or may not come up, because sometimes I would spell it completely off where like it doesn't even know what I'm trying to say. So I've been an avid user of Grammarly for many years, and it's been a godsend for me. And it helped me so many times, and it was super beneficial. But now with AI, there's even more, right? So if I can tell you about your particular type of dyslexia, then you'd understand it better to start with. So most of the time now is I'll give you this report, which is 12 to 18 pages, that says you are dyslexic. Now, first of all, if I'm dyslexic and you give me a 12 to 18 page report, I'm not going to read it, right? Because I'm not going to want to read it. It's long, it's lengthy, it's scientific, and it doesn't make sense to me. And you're giving it to someone, if they're getting diagnosed young, it's definitely not going to read it. So you just know that I'm not good at reading, writing, or spelling, and that's it. But what you need to change is the idea that what are you good at, not what are you not good at. So the support relies on trying to figure out what your strengths are as well, and then guiding you with different tools that are beneficial, whether it's Grammarly, whether it's speech to text, or being able to read out certain things, changing a PDF into a more dyslexic friendly font. Certain fonts are more easy to actually read for the dyslexic individuals than others. Like, for example, Times New Roman is not a good font for dyslexic individual, right? And you think why, but take the A, for example, the curve that goes like this, then back, and then does this. Just, I don't know what it does, but it does something to the brain, right? Where you kind of think of it as just this thing, because I write it as such. Calligraphy in Arabic, for example, it's impossible for me, right? So, you give me all this beautifully written stuff. It's like, I don't know what it says. So, another thing that's interesting is you could be dyslexic in one language more than the other, or in one language and not the other, right? So there's so much more yet to kind of discover and understand, and particularly in Arabic, for example, which is the next step that I would like to kind of go into once I understand that the platform works in English, because the resources are there and the studies are there, that going into Arabic and seeing that to help across the MENA region, those that are dyslexic in Arabic, or in schools that have no idea what dyslexia is.
So, Leith, the target now is to standardize testing across the region and try to partner up with institutions so that it's just part of the process, part of the education system to always test everyone to make sure that they don't find out 10 years later that they've been bad at school because it's something they have no control over? Is that like one of your
That's
objectives?
definitely one. That's definitely one. That's a big part of the objective, right? I mean, now if you look statistically, you have out of 20 dyslexic individuals, only one person is diagnosed. So that's one thing I want to change, making it more common, making it more, raising more awareness towards it, and then more than just that is actually helping said person, right? That's you helping this kid that's struggling with dyslexia, right? It could be as simple as I just need a little bit more time to read the question, right? And I will do so much better on my exams. But you don't know. And here's actually a funny statistic that for many years we thought was wrong, was that dyslexia is more common amongst men, but in reality it's equal amongst women and men. So male, female, it doesn't matter. But what mattered was that at a young age and more and even at an older age, females were more reserved and they wouldn't act out as much, and so they wouldn't notice that they might have a problem, right? A reading problem or a learning struggle. So they assumed that it was more common in men because they were the more recorded cases. But you need to figure out which ones are, and not just determine because a teacher may or may not have seen telltale signs. So I want to eliminate that factor, that human error, that you may not see something in a classroom, especially when you're dealing with like 30 kids at once and you want to figure out who's doing well, who's not.
Leith, I think it's so important what you're doing
Thanks.
because as someone who doesn't have dyslexia, I never think about it, ever.
Yeah.
It never comes up, not in any gathering, anything. So for someone who does, I feel like it's part of their daily life, something they're surrounded by, something they're used to that maybe people don't have never considered. So I think raising awareness about this, helping people to get diagnosed at a young age, helping them go through their educational system, I think it's so important what you're doing. And
Thank you.
and I really hope that this picks up, especially in the region where people tend to just ignore anything a child says,
Yeah.
that's out of the norm. So thank you so much for this, Leith.
No, of course. I mean, look, you'd be surprised now that once, I mean, post this discussion, right? I'm sure you'd go back and you'd be talking to some of your friends. You'd be like, yeah, I was talking to this person that dyslexic. Some of your friends would be like, oh, yeah, I'm dyslexic, right? And you'd be like, you're dyslexic, right? Because it's not something that you can't see it on anyone, right? Or now you'll kind of be like, oh, that makes sense now, because like you'd make these like silly mistakes sometimes, or like you don't like these specific things. Um, and yeah, you'd be surprised, and you'll see that it's a lot more common than you think. I mean, it's 1 out of 5. That's a lot of people. That's 20% of any population that may have dyslexia. Um, and yeah, it's not something that's very commonly known. But it's raising awareness a lot. I mean, it's really cool, really interesting. You even have like now Richard Branson, who's dyslexic, is creating what's called a Dyslexia University around this concept of dyslexic thinking. So things are moving. I mean, in the world, it's becoming more available, but I'm sure it's going to be slow to the region. So I want to start it in the region, and then hopefully take it beyond. But yeah,
Leith, thank you so much for your time. That was
no,
super
of course.
interesting.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.